Okay, hello, welcome everybody. It's my great pleasure that so many people found their way to the WZB today, and I think there have actually only been very few occasions that I saw this room so fully packed. A quarter of a century after the collapse of communism in the East and the experience of major economic crises that have repeatedly revealed the destructive forces of capitalism, the political left today still struggles with developing a convincing alternative vision to the status quo. Capitalism has neither been tamed by state regulations, nor has it yet collapsed. Although there is great discontent with the ever-growing social inequalities and the increasing commercialization of almost any aspect of human life, capitalism nonetheless seems to be an unalterable force of nature. Fortunately, not everybody thinks that there is no alternative, and we are hence very happy to have one of the most prominent intellectuals here today who thinks that another world is possible. The question that will guide this afternoon is, can capitalism be eroded, and I quote from the invitation to today's lecture, by building emancipatory alternatives in the spaces and cracks within capitalist economies? It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Erik Olin Wright today. Also, he's probably one of the few sociologists who does not need any introduction. Please allow me to say a couple of words on his impressive vita. Erik Olin Wright has been a professor of sociology at University of Wisconsin-Madison since 1976. He holds degrees from Harvard and Oxford and a PhD from UC Berkeley. His work on social classes and Marxism have become seminal, and there's certainly not a single social stratification scholar here in this room who has not drawn on Erik's work. Since 1992, Erik has directed the Real Utopias project, and from 2011 to 2012, he served as the president of the American Sociological Association. Erik has published widely and continuously in all the leading sociology journals and wrote and edited more than a dozen books, including the most recent ones, Envisioning Real Utopias, which, by the way, will appear in German early next spring, Understanding Class and Alternatives to Capitalism. While it's certainly great to have one superstar in the room, it's actually even better if you have two. I'm therefore very pleased to welcome Macartan Humphreys, who will comment on Erik Olin Wright's talk today. Macartan Humphreys is professor of political science at Columbia University and currently the Karl W. Deutsch professor at the WZB. Like Erik Olin Wright, Macartan Humphreys studied in Oxford and Harvard, where he received his PhD back in 2003. His work on research methodology, the political economy of development, governance, and conflict processes has been widely published in all the political science journals and well beyond. And like Erik Olin Wright, Macartan is the author and co-author of many, many books. By having Macartan commenting on Erik's talk, we'll have a true interdisciplinary discussion on the issues of alternatives to capitalism today. Although Erik and Macartan have a lot in common, in addition to sharing the same alma maters and aiming at improving people's lives and making a difference with their work, their research focus and methodologies are still different enough to foster a lively discussion. I look very much forward to the next 1.5 to 2 hours, and I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming both Erik Olin Wright and Macartan Humphreys.
So first, a sound check. Is this okay in the back? Everybody can hear? Well, here's the problem. We live in a world in which capitalism generates enormous harms, and yet to most people it seems like the only way of organizing a complex economic system. And that's a problem. To contend with that problem, I think we face three big tasks. First, we need a diagnosis and critique of capitalism to indeed demonstrate that the harms which people experience in their lives are in significant ways generated by capitalism as such, and not by certain other phenomena which might be thought of as correlates of capitalism. Thus, for example, some people believe that it's technology which causes the harms of life. You observe rising unemployment, stagnation, youth unemployment, and some people feel that the culprit is particular forms of technological change, not the social relations within which those technologies are deployed. So a first task is actually to provide a good and solid diagnosis of the problem and a critique of capitalism in light of that diagnosis. This is basically what lefty sociologists, political scientists, and the occasional heterodox economists do. They're mostly involved in the diagnosis and critique of the world as it is. Secondly, we need an account of alternatives. I mean, it's fine to demonstrate that capitalism causes harms, but if there is no alternative, well, it's like saying our bodies cause harms, right? We die, we age, we get creaky joints, we get disease. You can diagnose and critique the body, and you can do a lot to make it better, but the basic script is pretty much hardwired. It's not enough to demonstrate that capitalism generates harms. You also need an account of alternatives. And finally, it's not enough even really to have an account of alternatives. You need some way of theorizing and understanding how to get from here to there, the problem of transformation. It could be that there are viable alternatives to capitalism, alternatives which, if you could get there, you could stay there, and which would make life for the vast majority of people vastly better than under the existing world, but there may be no way to get from here to there. That's the problem of transformation. In much of my work, in the Real Utopias project, I focused on the second of these problems, thinking through the character of the alternative, demonstrating its desirability and viability, but not so much focusing on its achievability, which is the problem of transformation. What I want to focus on today is the problem of transformation. I'm going to briefly at the end say something about the character of the alternative. I think for the moment it's good enough to think of it as simply a democratic and egalitarian alternative to capitalism without worrying about what that means institutionally. Not that one shouldn't worry about what it means. Of course, that's a foundational problem. But I want to explore this strategy problem. And this leads to what is really another fundamental question. The question of strategy. Is it even possible to have a viable strategy for transforming the fundamental structures of an economic system? Not everything that one might want is strategically accessible. That is, we can't necessarily form a strategy to accomplish things, even if achieving them would be desirable. This is what might be called Friedrich Hayek's central thesis in The Fatal Conceit. Hayek makes the basic argument that the unintended consequences of attempts at changing important features of social structures, the unintended consequences are always bigger than the intended consequences, so that the perverse effects of what you try to do will overwhelm your purposes. You might think of this as two laws of Hayek. Hayek's first law is that unintended consequences are always worse than intended consequences, and the second law is the bigger the intended consequences, the bigger the unintended consequences. He therefore referred to the very thought of the possibility of fundamental transformation as the fatal conceit of intellectuals. We have the hubris that we can imagine the complexity of the world sufficiently precisely such that we can make fundamental changes without the whole thing blowing up in our face and creating chaos. Well, I disagree with the Hayekian pessimism, but I don't think it can be dismissed out of hand. The history of the 20th century is a sobering one, and it should be sobering for Marxist and radical egalitarian Democrats who really desperately want to believe that another world is possible, but also that another world can be made. I want to therefore explore how we can make sense of a strategy that is at least plausible. I'm not going to give you a proof that, yes, if you follow my recipe, we'll transcend capitalism, but that it has plausibility and doesn't fall into the Hayekian abyss of opening up perverse consequences of the sort that necessarily subvert the purposes of radical transformation. Now, to do this, I will use what might be thought of as the fundamental conceptual tool of sociology, the 2x2 table. When I have students who come to me with a list of 3 things, I tell them, what's the 4th? Because if you have a list of 3, and of course I'm being glib here, but there's actually some sense to to my joke with my students. If you have a list of 3 things and you want to give it theoretical order, chances are there's more than one dimension. So sometimes a list of 3 things are just an extreme and a middle on some spectrum. But if it's at all more complex than that, probably there's 2 dimensions underlying your list of 3. But if there's 2 dimensions, there should be a 4th. And if there isn't, that's interesting. It says something about the nature of the dimensions. So it's a good exercise for those of you who like to fool around with building concepts and giving them precision. It's hard to beat the 2x2 table. Well, here's my 2x2 table for strategic logics of anti-capitalism. Now, I'm going to use the term anti-capitalism here because rather than to give a positive name to an alternative, because in the first instance, strategies are a reaction to harms which are seen in capitalism. And then exactly what those strategies are pointing to is an additional step, which we'll come to later. So the first dimension of strategic logics of anti-capitalism is the goal of strategy. And here there are 2 basic goals. The goal of the strategy can be to transcend the structure, to go beyond capitalism, or to neutralize the harms of capitalism. Second dimension of this typology is the primary locus of the strategy. And strategies can be directed at the state, trying to either capture or influence state power to be used for various purposes, or strategies can be located and have their main focus outside of the state. I'm using the term civil society here in the loosest and encompassing sort of way. So we have 4 possible strategic types. My argument is that this is a pretty inclusive list. I mean, I'm sure there are strategic ideas which may not neatly fall into the 4 cells, as is inevitable in any typological form of concept formation. But I think these pretty much capture the range of strategies that anti-capitalist individuals and groups and parties and movements have adopted at different times in history and in different circumstances. So first, smashing capitalism, the revolutionary option. The goal is to transcend structures, to go beyond capitalism. The focus is on the state as the central locus where that can take place. The revolutionary imaginary that sees this strategy as coherent argues that when historical conditions are right, of course that requires its own specification, state power is seized. It can be seized through democratic means or through insurrectionary means. That's not intrinsic to the problem. State power is seized. The state itself is radically transformed in order to make it a suitable instrument to destroy the centers of power of capitalism. And smashing capitalism in that sense becomes the political objective of a state that has itself been transformed to make that smashing possible. The strongest versions of this theory in a certain form of the Marxist tradition, the strongest versions say that capitalism itself, as it develops, renders itself ever more fragile. The crisis tendencies through the contradictions of capitalism and its laws of motion make capitalism itself an unreproducible social order, so that it becomes increasingly smashable, if you will. And at the same time, and this is of course the beauty of the classical theory, capitalism creates a historical subject capable of seizing the opportunity of that fragility to seize state power and transform the underlying economic structure. Smashing capitalism in one form or another animated revolutionary movements from some time towards the latter decades of the 19th century through much of into the middle decades or so of the 20th century. Now, I have no principled objection to smashing capitalism if I felt it was smashable. I, however, think that the evidence from the 20th century is not one to give one much confidence that it is smashable. There's two problems, from my point of view, with the smashing capitalism strategic idea. One is it's very hard to imagine in most places in the world, certainly in any developed capitalist country, that a political force could ever be in a position to even attempt to smash capitalism, that is, seizing state power in such a way that it could be deployed for that purpose. And secondly, if the attempt was made, it's very hard to see that a democratic, egalitarian, emancipatory alternative would be the result of the smashing. The last line of the anthem of the Wobblies, the American labor movement of the early 20th century, of their famous song, Solidarity Forever, the last line is, "We will build a new world from the ashes of the old." We will build a new world from the ashes of the old. It's fantastic imagery. We know it's possible to burn down. What we haven't any evidence for is the possibility of building the new world we want from the ashes of the old. That's essentially, if you will, the Hayek point, that the chaotic, unintended consequences set in motion by that particular strategic effort creates uncontrollable problems of social order that can be resolved, at least in historical experience, only through repressive means, and the repressive means block the possibility of a democratic, egalitarian alternative. Well, nevertheless, smashing capitalism remains alive as a part of the way people think about this. I gave a talk last week in London at King's College at a seminar called the London Marxism Seminar. And the main point of contention in what was a long hour of discussion following the talk was on this point. There were plenty of smashers in the audience who really felt that a revolutionary rupture was the only way to go, and that it would not be self-destructive. So I think it's still part of the conversation, but I don't think it's politically or historically plausible. The second strategic option is taming capitalism. This is the classic stance of at least the progressive side of social democracy. The term social democracy, as you all certainly know, has lost much of its radical edge. Social democratic parties have become, in many contexts, parties of not taming capitalism, but unleashing capitalism. If you think of neoliberalism as a kind of political, ideological complex which has lots of different dimensions, but whatever it is, it's unleashing capitalism, not taming it. And social democratic parties often see that as part of what's needed for either for their political survival or for their particular goals. So I'm talking about the more classic leftish version of social democracy. Social democrats often shared the same critique of capitalism as generating severe harms, but felt that it was possible through the deployment of state power to neutralize its harms, to neutralize those harms, to at least take enough of the edge off of those harms as to create a tolerable, if not benign, capitalism. You know, and this is a joke if any of you happen to have seen any of the videos of earlier versions of this talk, I know there's always in the audience somebody who had checked out on YouTube and saw an earlier version of a talk, and so some of the jokes I tell are the same. And I always feel it's a bit lame, but I can't come up with a new joke every time I give. So the joke I tell with respect to this particular problem is, I have 2 daughters who have recently had babies, so I'm finally a grandfather. And often the babies keep them up at night and they wake up with a headache. That's a harm, you know, it's an unpleasant exhaustion. And there's 2 solutions. You can take an aspirin that's neutralizing the harm, or you can get rid of the cause of the harm, get rid of the baby. They have wisely decided to take aspirins, as it were. Sometimes neutralizing harms is good enough. And that's been, I think, the classic social democratic view, that capitalism was tameable, that you could institute a set of policies. Sure, it requires mobilization, it requires a strong labor movement, it requires political confrontation. It's not going to come just from enlightenment, but you can accomplish it. And then the heyday of social democracy, I think, capitalism was reasonably tamed, at least with respect to certain of the harms which it tends to generate, especially harms around risk. And thus the social insurance state was a significant feature, but also the regulatory state was a significant feature of that effort at taming capitalism. I would still argue that taming capitalism is a form of anti-capitalism. This would require a lot more discussion, but it's fundamentally that the actual mechanisms in place to tame capitalism make capitalism less capitalistic. It's a less purely capitalist form. That's what those mechanisms do. So the partial decommodification of labor, the provision of satisfaction of people's needs that are market independent, is a less capitalistic form of capitalism. So in that sense, taming capitalism goes against capitalism, even if it still neutralizes harms rather than transcends capitalism. Third strategy, resisting capitalism. This is probably almost certainly the oldest form of reaction to the harms of capitalism. Resisting capitalism takes place whenever workers get together to form a union and to engage in collective action to improve working conditions or wages. But resisting capitalism also occurs on the shop floor, when workers in their own micro contexts resist the depredations of bosses and foremen and the like. Resisting capitalism is defensive. It opposes things that happen. It's not directed at the state. When it is directed at the state, it becomes part of a political complex that includes taming capitalism. And finally, there's escaping capitalism. Escaping capitalism is also a very venerable reaction to capitalist harms. If you think about the 19th century in the United States, when workers and small farmers from the East Coast went west as pioneers to homestead on the prairie. I grew up in Kansas, so the prairies of the Midwest in the United States. What were they doing? They were moving away from the centers of capitalist power to be subsistence producers, primarily producing for their own needs and only marketing whatever surplus they happened to produce in a given year. But the goal was self-sufficiency. That was the vision of the yeoman farmer, small farmer moving westward. And the provisions of the Homestead Act, which made the occupation of unused, by American government terms, unused, indigenous people's land for purposes of agriculture, the provision of the amount of acreage that went with that was enough to support a family, basically. It was kind of like an unconditional basic income grant in the form of a capital grant in land. That's what the Homestead Act was in the 19th century. And it enabled people to escape, temporarily, capitalism. But I would also say this is what motivates many cooperatives, worker cooperatives, for example, are efforts by workers in various forms to escape some of the forms of domination which are part of the package of capitalist relations. Worker cooperatives involve workers owning their own means of production and democratically directing the use of that productive capacity. So escaping capitalism is an old and venerable response. It also includes, of course, things that are less political, have less of a kind of political valence to them. The hippie slogan from the 1960s, tune in, turn on, drop out, was a kind of individualistic escape from capitalism as well. Escaping capitalism often is not given much theoretical or political relevance by people on the left because precisely they see it as an effort to avoid any political confrontation rather than to engage in a political process of transformation. Well, these are four ideal types. Actual struggles typically combine in different ways these strategic logics. The communist movement in the 20th century can be thought of as a combination of resisting and smashing. The communist movement was always deeply invested in working within the labor movement and often played a very active and militant and progressive role in the shop floor and the organization of workers for confrontations and resistance within capitalism itself. The idea of that involvement in the shop floor was both that it was itself intrinsically valuable, but also it would help create the conditions under which a political movement would then be able to smash capitalism. So it was simultaneously resisting capitalism and part of the project of a more revolutionary transformation. Social democracy and the labor movement can be thought of as combining taming and resisting capitalism. When social democracy was at its most robust and radical, consistently left radical form, I think it's because of its deep connection to militant resistance in the labor movement itself. That combination of a strong labor movement with the social democratic movement being close to a political arm of the labor movement was the combination that allowed for the most durable taming strategies. Thus, taming itself, when it's cut off from resisting, I think drifts into more conventional kinds of political orientations. One might even want to say that part of the reason why social democratic type parties in Europe have become more neoliberal in their kind of policy imagination is precisely because they have been cut off for various reasons from any level of militancy in the labor movement itself. And finally, social movements, especially, I think, in the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, the kind of social movements we see in the global south and somewhat in the north as well, often try to combine resisting capitalism with escaping capitalism. The efforts of some social movements to foster the social and solidarity economy, for example, those efforts, if you think of in Latin America, the landless peasants movement effort to foster the development of a social economy combines resistance and escape, wanting to build alternatives where possible, but in the context of resisting landlords and landholders and other capitalist forces. What I'm proposing then is this configuration. I'm proposing a way of thinking about strategies opposed to capitalism that combine taming and escaping and connect both of these to resistance. The idea is to tame capitalism in ways that make it easier to escape and to escape capitalism in ways that make it easier to tame. Underlying this strategic logic is a particular way of understanding what it means to transcend capitalism. So this is a way of approaching the problem which does point beyond capitalism, but it does so without also demanding a rupture. Well, how is that possible? What does it mean to point beyond capitalism as a strategic objective? That's why there is the lower right-hand corner, to point beyond capitalism, but without imagining that you can get beyond capitalism by a rupture in the system itself. That's why I'm calling it eroding. Okay, to understand this, we have to step back a little bit, and we're going to jump up to a little bit of meta theory here for a brief moment. And it has to do with what we even mean by the use of the word system when we talk about a capitalist system or an economic system. What's the systemness of a system? How should we think of that idea? I'll give you two metaphors of two different ways that social scientists, social theorists, I think about what it means to talk about a system. First metaphor sees the society as a system or an economy as a system in much the way that a biologist would see an organism as a system. Organisms are functionally integrated systems, right? We have a human person has lots of parts. The parts pretty much fit together. There's not a whole lot of leeway as to how well they fit together. Each part has a function, and the function of the part can be specified with respect to the functioning of the whole. The use of the term, which biologists don't use but some social theorists do, the term totality, seems to work pretty well when you're thinking about how the systemness of a body works. Human being, the body is a totality. The different parts have functions, and their functions are to be explained by how they fit into the functioning of the system as a whole. Let's call that the organic system model. An alternative model, metaphor, really, for thinking about social systems is an ecosystem, like a pond or a lake, body of water. So a body of water is a system in the sense that everything in it affects everything else one way or another. There's interactions between the different features of a body of water. It has a terrain, it has plants that grow in it, it has different kinds of fish, other kinds of critters, different mineral deposits, different pollution sources, etc. So all these things interact. So there's clearly causal interconnections. And the causal interconnections, once you know what's in the lake, are theorizable. But it is not a tightly integrated system. It's not like a body. You can introduce an invasive species, an alien species into a lake, and sometimes they will just die off. Other times they will survive in a little niche in some corner of the lake. Other times they can become an invasive species and take over the lake. You wouldn't ask, what is the function of the invasive species? If there's a frog in the lake, you don't ask, what is the function of the frog? That's just not the way to think about it. Lakes aren't the kinds of entities that have a process of natural selection that produces this lake needs a frog and therefore a frog evolves to fill the lake. Now, there may be an equilibrium at some point, and so the lake doesn't change much over long periods of time. That just means that all the non-functionally interdependent things work in harmony with each other. But that's still different from the logic by which we explain why a human organism has a heart. All right, I think societies are more like ecosystems, and economic structures are more like ecosystems than they are like bodies. To call German capitalism and American capitalism and Swedish and British capitalism, to call all of these capitalism is a shorthand for saying these are complex economic ecosystems within which capitalism is dominant, but within which there are many different types of non-capitalist relations. Some of those non-capitalist relations have been functionalized by capitalism, that is, they've been rendered useful for capitalism. Others are irrelevant to capitalism, they just coexist. and some may be anti-capitalist. The ecosystem can be filled with irritants and dysfunctions. There's no law of nature, so to speak, which stipulates that the economic ecosystem has to be functionally integrated, in which all of the non-capitalist elements are functionalized, that is, rendered functional for the functioning of capitalism. Some of them may just coexist and be coexisting in ways which reduce the profitability or the functionality of capitalism. The system can muddle through. It's a loosely coupled system rather than a totality in that sense. Now, that's the conception of an economic system which makes possible the idea of eroding capitalism. With that as your way of thinking about what we're talking about in an economic system, one can then imagine various kinds of non-capitalist forms developing in the spaces and cracks where you can develop them. And some of these could be developed purposefully, that is, as a result of strategy, not just spontaneously through the adaptations of people. And then maybe struggles can be oriented towards expanding those spaces. This is more or less the way, at least many people think about how capitalism emerges inside of feudalism. Right, so sometime in the Middle Ages, there wasn't much. There were still some markets, but there wasn't really much that you could call proto-capitalism. But sometime in the late Middle Ages, merchants begin to have greater ambitions. They develop various capacities for long-distance trade. They innovate with new forms of contract so that they can reliably trade over long distance. All sorts of innovations occur, centered in the cities. And a new set of relations, economic relations, begin to emerge and consolidate inside of what remains a feudal society. It remains feudal in terms of where the domination of, where the power is located, how the state functions, and where the dominant interests that shape the way people gain their livelihood, how those are organized. Feudal elites find this proto-capitalist merchant capitalism useful. There is a kind of symbiotic relationship between these emerging non-feudal relations and feudalism. One might say that that enables feudalism to co-opt this proto-capitalism, to use it for its own purposes. It does so, but in such a way that ultimately it undermines its own foundations. That's called a contradiction, right? That spread out over a very long period of time. Now, in the case of the transition from feudalism to capitalism and the emergence of capitalism, this wasn't a strategy. It wasn't the case that a group of medieval merchants were sitting around at a conference, so to speak, and saying, damn it, feudalism really sucks. How can we get rid of it? How can we transcend it? Wouldn't it be great if we could be the ruling class and our interests could dominate in shaping the rhythm? Of course not. I mean, they said, how can we improve the reliability of our contracts and make it easier for us to consolidate our capacity to extract rents and interest? Maybe we should talk to these feudal lords and see if we can be helpful to them, et cetera, et cetera. The new relations emerge as adaptations by actors whose strategies are just oriented around their own self-interest, among other things. I don't think that's how capitalism itself will be transcended. It's certainly not if we want to transcend it towards a democratic, egalitarian alternative that promotes human flourishing. That requires a strategy. It requires a vision of an alternative and then thinking about how we can build possibilities inside of capitalism that move us towards that alternative, while at the same time fitting into a market economy and solving some problems within capitalism itself. And that's the kind of strategic logic of eroding capitalism. What eroding capitalism says is, let's think of ways in which we can tame capitalism, policies and projects that we can institute through the state, that expand the possibility of building alternatives, that is, escaping capitalism, and yet can be institutionalized because it also helps solve problems in capitalism itself. These are what in the late 1970s were called non-reformist reforms. An example of that would be, one of my favorite examples is an unconditional basic income. Unconditional basic income is a reform of the mechanisms of redistribution, right? It says, let's replace all the means-tested specialty programs of income transfer with a simple program in which everybody in an economic system, anybody in a politically bounded economic system receives a monthly stipend sufficient to meet basic needs. I think an unconditional basic income should go for citizens and legal residents, not just citizens. Tourists don't get it, but anybody who is a part of the society in a stable way gets an unconditional basic income. Now, usually unconditional basic income is advocated on the grounds that it solves certain pressing problems of social justice, which it does. It solves the problems of poverty, for example, by just guaranteeing that nobody lives below a basic level of a kind of generous view of basic needs. But unconditional basic income is also a way of transferring part of the social surplus from capital accumulation to social accumulation. It enables, for example, worker co-ops, worker cooperatives to thrive. Worker cooperatives are much more viable in a world with basic income than in a world without it. There's an irony here. You can think of unconditional basic income as a way of solving the failures of credit markets that worker cooperatives face. One of the biggest bottlenecks for worker cooperatives is getting loans for their businesses. Workers aren't rich. They don't have capital stocks. They need loans from banks. A bank looks at their business plan and says, this looks interesting, but you're not going to generate enough income from your business plan to both pay us back and feed your families. The problem that worker cooperatives face is that they have to generate too much income early on because they have to provide income for their members. Capitalist investors can go for years without getting a return on their investment. It doesn't matter. You know, they can have a long time horizon for it. Worker co-ops can't because of the problem of lack of capital. Well, if an unconditional basic income is given to everybody, suddenly a business plan that in an ordinary bank sense, so this doesn't require a benevolent bank that likes cooperatives, just a regular bank, looks at this business plan, asks, how likely is it that the principal and interest will get paid back? The income stream from the plan looks adequate for that, and the bank doesn't have to worry whether it's enough to actually provide a living stipend for the workers themselves, because that's done through basic income. Okay, so the point here is basic income is a way of solving a range of problems in capitalism. Many people now argue that it's actually good for capitalism. It's a kind of permanent Keynesian infusion of resources on the demand side, so it'll be good for capitalists. They'll be able to sell their stuff more. That may be a problem for environmental reasons, but let's bracket that here for the moment. Solves problems in capitalism, but it opens up greater space for people to build alternatives to capitalism. Well, so that's the basic argument. There are three key issues still to be resolved. I will only just very briefly mention each of these. I'm not, this would take us far too long. In the discussion, we can come back to these themes. There's three additional issues that need to be resolved. What is the alternative? I've given a little bit of by invoking the values that would be present in the alternative, democratic, egalitarian values. I would add solidarity as well, democracy, equality, and solidarity as the kind of key values, but I haven't said much about institutions. What is the alternative? Second issue, the theory of the state. Can a capitalist state contribute to eroding capitalism? And the problem of agency. Who are the collective agents for struggle for these objectives? Let me just give you the synoptic punchline for each of these analyses. First, the destination. The destination, I argue, requires thinking of socialism as a radical heterogeneous economic democracy. This is what I refer to sometimes as taking the social in socialism seriously. The core of socialism is the notion of the social empowerment of people, which is essentially economic democracy. And I've just given a few bullet points to give some meaning to what that's talking about. Replace market-conforming democracy, Merkel's formulation of how we should think of democracy, it should conform to the market, with democracy-conforming markets. Expand and deepen the cooperative market sector and the social economy. Protect the commons and expand the array of public goods. And democratize the corporation. Now, each of these is a big topic. And the last one may seem particularly mysterious. And we can talk about these if you wish. Second, the capitalist state. The key issue here is to democratize democracy, to make the capitalist state a more deeply and profoundly democratic structure. I think the democratization of democracy expands the limits for the development of socialist relations within capitalism, precisely because the socialist relations, as I've defined them, that is democratic egalitarian economic relations, are the sorts of economic practices that encourage and facilitate human flourishing, and under a more democratic form of capitalism, those are the kinds of economic relations which I think would be fostered. Again, much has been slid over in such a formulation. And finally, agency. What's needed, and this is more a placeholder for an answer than an actual answer, what's needed is constructing a democratic egalitarian coalition for multi-layered collective action. What that means is harnessing non-class identities, the kinds of identities which people feel are salient in their immediate lives, showing people how opposing capitalism is a way of fulfilling the needs of non-class identities, and then connecting that to the class interests in transforming capitalism itself. I refer to this as a democratic egalitarian coalition for multi-layered collective action because the collective action occurs at many different kinds of sites, in communities, in states, in organizations. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to be responding to Erik Olin Wright. I've been a fan of Erik's work since undergraduate, so it's a great thing to meet you finally. I think one problem with my response to you is that basically I agree with most of the goals, and most of my comments are on the structure of the argument. And so, some of them I think touch a little bit fundamentally on whether this is being approached the right way or not. But in terms of the what I might agree with is the goals of the strategy, and possibly also the details of the strategy also. So it's some structural questions I want to address here mostly. So a quick recap of the argument. The question is, well, how to react to capitalism? We've got a sort of a strategy set here. They're not exclusive strategies, obviously. There's smash, tame, resist, escape. The solution, in a sense, is that smashing is not likely to work. 1 and 3 have been tried by revolutionaries. 2 and 3 have been tried by social democrats. 3 and 4 by civil society groups. How about 2, 3, and 4? And let's call that. So that's the 1-minute version of the talk. So I'm going to question a little bit, this idea of capitalism. This is one of the one thing I enjoyed sort of reading through this was sort of reflecting on these questions I hadn't thought about for a while, and I'm going to try to make the argument that capitalism isn't a worthy opponent for you. That's the argument I'm going to try and make for this here. I'm going to raise some concerns I have over the distinction between resist and escape. In particular, I find hard in many ways. But actually, a lot of my comments are more about this particular structure of these 4 strategies, whether these really follow from an analytic framework or not, and whether they're stopping us from looking at other possibilities. So I'm going to try and look at that. I've bolded here whether smashing is not likely to work. I'm not going to talk about that, but I just raise it as something that we really don't know a lot about. So people often point to the early 20th century. Many people say it wasn't really tried in the right way. There's other alternatives and so on. I'm going to question a little bit the optimism around at least the use of the term erosion, which suggests a kind of slightly sort of has a sort of teleological sort of feel to it. So I'm going to start off with what wasn't here, but is certainly in other work, such as Envisioning Utopias, to try and start off with some sort of definition of what we mean by capitalism. And for this talk, I'm going to run with a very particular definition. I'm not sure if you'll fully agree with it. But it's the key idea here is we're going to focus on freedom of contract. And the idea is basically it's a regime, so in the ideal case, we're talking about an ideal case of capitalism, it's a regime with the possibility for only voluntary, so not coercive, for only voluntary contracting with anyone about anything at any agreed price. That's the basic idea. Now, in Envisioning Utopias and elsewhere, I think there are two ideas caught up here. There's contracting and also private ownership of capital. I've stayed with this first one here because it seems to me that this notion of private ownership is largely subsumed by the idea of contracting. That's partly what we mean. So there's probably ideas there I haven't fully seen. The idea of limited government, or sort of the role of government, is also included in this notion of whether there's freedom to contract or absolute freedom of contract or not. And one thing to point out is from this definition at least, the idea of competitive markets is not implied by the idea of capitalism, right? So a lot of the arguments for capitalism that people use assume competitive markets. The fundamental theorems of welfare economics assume competitive markets, but under this definition at least, it's not implied by it. Okay, and I would notice something that's also noted during the talk, but I think it's quite important that when we talk about the effects of capitalism, effects are only really defined with respect to a counterfactual, right? And so there can be a tendency to say we don't like capitalism because of these various things it does. But the counterfactual in many places in the world is various forms of despotism, or feudal structures and so on, as was raised here. Okay. So that's my graph of capitalism there. So I'm going to use this graph a few times. And the idea of the graph is you've got lots of people, and these are choice sets. Each person, you can think of, there's lots of things they can do. Okay, and they've got those are free choices, and they can choose from any of these things. So I want to point out what I think are four distinct ways in which we often hear the idea that capitalism bears the seeds of its own destruction. So I think there are four distinct ways in which that's meant, which matters for this argument. And one of these is based on kind of an empirical conjecture. One of them, I think, is sort of off target. It sort of misses the target a little bit. And two of them are really fundamental. And it's those more fundamental features that I think raise the question about whether capitalism as an idea is a worthy or useful target for formulating our concerns with social organization. So the first is the one people think of most, which is the Marxist argument, and that capitalist dynamics lead to unsustainable immiserization, right? Which may or may not be true. There's different models of capitalist structures in which that may or may not be true. In the work of Piketty and sort of related sort of work, it's suggested that there is this tendency towards concentration and so on, and may lead to this. I sort of have in brackets there, this sort of requires a non-strategic model, so when people do formal models of revolution and rebellion and these sorts of things, sort of capitalists get this and they sort of take action in order to prevent this, right? So it's a sort of, in a way, it's an empirical conjecture. It doesn't seem to really have held up, and theoretically it's not completely obvious. But anyway, that's the Marxist claim. And in terms of the graph, this claim is, well, this graph won't look like this forever, right? It's a dynamic claim, right? So capitalism will disappear in some sense. The second is sort of a more industrial organization type claim, which is that if capitalism leads to monopolies, then you'll no longer have free markets, and you won't have competitive competition. So in order to maintain competitive markets, you have to intervene, right? So compromise is needed for competitive markets. Right? Under the definition I've given, this one slightly misses the mark, right? Because there's nothing inconsistent with monopolies and capitalism. There is something inconsistent with monopolies and competitive markets. The next two, I think, are the deeper ones, which is that, if the focus of capitalism is on voluntary exchange, then you sort of have to stop the non-voluntary exchange. This is the sort of the public choice or sort of political economy argument, which means you have to have something like a state. These are all very familiar arguments, but you have to have something like a state. In order to have something like a state, if there's a collective action problem, you need something like taxes. You need some sort of set of coercive non-voluntary exchanges, right? So compromise is actually needed to ensure voluntary choice. Okay? So in fact, in order for this to even exist, right, as a set of choices, there has to be a limitation on the set of choices, which means that this is not a dynamic argument. This is that even the idea, assuming any sort of tendency towards non-voluntary coercive action is possible, suggests that this ideal type is not sort of internally fully coherent. But the last one, I think, is sort of deeper, which is I'm going to call it the strategic philosophical claim, this is sort of an argument that Sen has used and others, which is, well, if in fact we're in a world in which one person's choice affects the choice sets of other people, then this graph is wrong, right? We can't think of people making whole sets of independent choices, right? What happens is a function of the particular profiles of choices that occur. So the graph misrepresents the problem, and we're stuck with a situation where we've got a very weak distinction, actually, between voluntary and involuntary exchange. Right? So one of the striking things, if people go and look at the formal models of violence that exist, the whole series of formal models of coercion and violence, formally, they look almost exactly like a model of voluntary exchange with negative externalities. Right? Structurally, there's no real difference. Right? Formally, it's very hard to get this distinction of what voluntary and involuntary exchange is. And so this sort of idea of voluntary sort of independent choices is kind of a hard one to sustain. So that left me a little bit worried. It's sort of the idea of unrestricted free choice is incoherent in strategic environments, right? So if theoretically this is sort of something that doesn't really make sense, it's being sort of used to package some sort of vision, but doesn't quite make sense as a thing. Not that it's not good, but it doesn't make sense. And if in practice no one's trying to do this anyway, right? So people may be very keen on having freedom of mobility of capital, but there's not anywhere near the same sort of demand of freedom of mobility of labor. So capitalists are not seeking this ideal of a free market exchange. The question is, should researchers and activists stop focusing on this mythical enemy and focus instead on the specific ways actual economies are organized, right? So sort of drop this sort of smashing, taming, all this sort of mythical beast, and instead look at all these varieties of system we have, and what's the appropriate response for the systems that we actually have, given a set of desiderata that we might have, right, which are not fully specified here. So one way of saying this, and this is sort of my first big point, is maybe different varieties of capitalism may call for different varieties of anti-capitalism. Right? And if we start off with this idea of capitalism as being a thing, then we might be led away from that goal. Okay, that's the sort of first sort of comment. The second comment is around the analytic structure and whether these are the right set of strategies, or how to make sense of these strategies. So a good part of the power of the chapter is bringing these recognizable strategies into this sort of analytic framework. It looks like the way this sort of went is, first of all, identifying the strategies and then figuring out sort of what makes sense of these strategies, right? I was wondering, would it be fruitful to go in the opposite direction, in the sense of thinking about what are the dimensions that we substantively care about, maybe the levers that we can pull, and see what sort of space of strategies are created by those levers. So start off with the dimensions and then get the cells, rather than starting off with the cells, which are sort of historical things that came together, and figuring out what dimensions lie behind them. From the table itself, I kept on having a difficulty distinguishing between resist and escape in various ways. I'll come back to that a little bit. But I think here my problem was that transcending is a hard word for me. I didn't know what was involved in the idea transcending, if it's sort of a change in the structure or just ignoring structures and so on. So, more specificity on that would have helped me. But also on the rows, it wasn't fully clear to me whether the focus, we talk about the locus of strategy, whether the focus is on who is doing the action or where the action has its effect. I think it's the latter. I might have called it rules of the game or rules of the game, which is sort of what are the set of actions you can take, and then the actions given the rules. So one is about the choices that exist, and the second is what should people actually do given the choices that are there. But I didn't get other titles for the columns. Anyway, going the opposite direction, here are a few dimensions you might care about. So who's the target, right? So who are you taking action against, right? And I think it came up towards the end of the talk, but the second dimension, very different strategy, is who is the actor. There's a sort of a we in the background to this chapter, and I wasn't sure who that we is, whether it's an organized group or a disorganized group. This has citizens. All citizens should be a set of citizens, and so on. Another dimension that's sort of missing at the moment is whether the focus should be, say, national focus or global focus, right? So interestingly, in a way, when you set up a national anti-capitalist system, that could be described as a smashing capitalism. It could equivalently be described as an escaping capitalism, as far as it's escaping global capitalism. So this dimension seemed important. And then something I'll come back to again is whether the focus is, this is kind of going to structure or choice, but whether the focus should be on the relations of production or on social preferences in a way, right? So the focus on the minimum wage is in a way looking at the distribution of factors in a sense. But throughout the chapter, sort of there was a kind of a notion that people's preferences themselves are pretty fixed. And this is something I've sort of been wondering about, so there's lots of evidence that people's preferences, historically, change in many ways, and whether that should be part of people's strategy when they want to bring about change. It certainly is actually a part of the strategy that's being used by, say, international development actors that are trying to bring about change, often not very successfully, but wondering where it fits in this toolkit. Okay, so a few of my graphs of capitalism and I'm using these to try and spell out some of these issues. So the basic issue is we have this notion of the free market possibilities, lots of choices. We've got the great choices, the red choices, terrible choices. They do terrible things, environmental externalities, exploitation, and the rest of it. So many choices, some good and some bad. And the problem is, with uncoordinated action, contra Adam Smith, we may end up in a situation where there's lots of bad choices taken. Okay? So what do we do about this? Abundant scope for exploitation, ignoring negative externalities, and so on. So the taming, as I understand it, what the taming is doing is it's saying, let's try and go from there to here, right? So what's happening here is we're limiting the set of actions people have, right? So you can't pay this wage, actually. You can't sell this part of your body, actually. The whole set of limits on the sorts of trades that are possible. You can't not pay your taxes and carry your debt forwards 20 years or whatever. So hopefully when that happens, you're going to have fewer bad choices. That's kind of a hope that comes out of that. The smashing, in a way, is, so sort of in this setup, the smashing is kind of just an extension of that, right? Smashing is a situation where, in the extreme case, you're limiting everyone's choice set to one. This is what people should be doing, right? And you're hopefully doing it so you get no bad choices. Hopefully it's doable, but you sort of have to worry about the sort of Hayek kind of considerations, right? Can we set this up? Resisting, so resisting strikes, boycotts, consumer power. The idea is that you're not altering these choice sets at all, but you're hoping that people will take, so the thicker lines of what people actually take, the people will take a set of things where mostly what's taken is good actions or not bad actions. But it's not a structural change, right? So if that's right, then the question is, how does this come about? In international development work, this is what people are doing all the time. They're not actually altering choice sets in any sort of meaningful way and sort of intervening in the hopes that people will just take different choices. And a lot of it's not really very effective. Okay. these can be combined, taming and resisting. You can both reduce the choice sets available and hope people take the right choices. Although there's an interesting thing here. The more that you reduce the set of options that are available to people, the less people who are trying to coordinate on optimal choices are able to do that. Right? So there's a kind of a natural tension that I thought is worth sort of highlighting between the taming and resisting. Right? If you believe people can choose optimal choices in some, for some outcomes, then the reduction of that set, even with good intentions, can have negative outcomes. And the last one is the one I was sort of most concerned about, which is escaping. So I'm going to give a few examples in a second, but the idea is with escaping, what's happening in this graph here is, if you can see, the trades are all much more clustered, right? So people are now, they've got the same choice sets as before. Right? We haven't changed the structures of what they can do, but now people in a region are trading with each other, or people in the same class are trading with each other, or people are going to kibbutz, or people are doing something else. Right? They're escaping and trying to engage in the same sort of trades. And so what this is sort of pointing out is that may lead to transformation, a transcendence of capitalism. It may lead to a lot of very bad local choices also, right? And so the sort of examples I have in mind here are things like communities deciding that they're not going to provide haircuts to homosexuals. Right? What's happening here is a voluntary limitation of the sorts of trades that can take place that's sort of decided in a very decentralized manner by a set of people. Escaping free choice, everyone can do everything relations by imposing those local constraints. No guarantee that, that this is moving in the direction that one wants things to move. Okay, and so the last comment on this is that, in principle, I had this. I sort of commented that there's a tension between the taming and the resisting. In principle, optimal resistance can happen without taming. So if it's possible to coordinate people's actions a given way, having the optimal choices, it should be possible to replicate the choices that would be made under the ideal planning situation without the taming. Okay, so we're left here with, I think the two main comments in these system models is we've got a set of models that are not, to my mind, fully distinct from each other, but also not exhaustive, given the set of possible models one might have. There's a certain difficulty, especially, I think, with the sort of resistance and escaping approaches. So two I'm pointing to here is, one is that the resistance is parasitical on the taming, right? In the sense of what resistance actions are allowed depends upon the taming strategy. So for example, people might say we want to engage in boycotts. For example, BDS is the academic boycott and cultural boycott against Israel. Right now, it's illegal in the state of New York, or at least if you're in the state of New York and you engage in BDS, you can be stripped of all state funding, for example. It's illegal in Israel to be supporting BDS. There are moves to prevent the labeling of GMO, for example. That's been a big issue in Europe and also in some US states. So you might have this strategy of resistance, but it is sort of parasitical on this higher level problem. And the second concern is that decentralized solutions produce some social bads. Could produce the same social bad as capitalism. So a second example is refusing to give jobs to co-ethnics, right? So discrimination. A lot of the constraints that we have, that we place, are trying to produce outcomes that are supportive of capital, but not all are. Okay. So the last comment I have, and this is about strategies, is that the idea of erosion, it sounds very promising, it sounds sort of very optimistic. But erosion, insofar as erosion suggests that once you go down this path, and once you start getting these corners of the lake in which you're planting sort of non-capitalist or anti-capitalist ideas, that they will stay there, and then you move forward and you sort of grow, right? I was wondering what is the model of capitalism that sort of supports that optimism, right? The image people often have of capitalism is that the more you try to suppress it, the more it pushes back, the more it regains ground. So why would we not expect capitalism just to reassert itself? And it'd be nice to think of an answer to that in the context of, well, what is changing in the dynamic processes that we're currently looking at? So we've got a global context in the sort of long view. We've got continued population growth. We've got big changes arising from things like climate change. We've got big political changes arising from the rise of political multipolarity. But we're also seeing long-term change in values people have, right? So obviously, it's this is going in many directions at the same time. But I was really struck. I think everyone's kind of glued to the U.S. elections at the moment. It's sort of striking that you can have a candidate with sort of values that seem so anachronistic, in the U.S. elections. But what's also striking is that it is anachronistic. That these are sorts of values that many candidates would have had in the past, and it wouldn't have been an issue, right? So if it is an issue now, and to the point where it may lead to a large change in the elections. And so should we be thinking about how to conceptualize major changes in our social structure without taking account of how sort of social preferences are evolving over time?
There was a lot in that presentation, needless to say, that is hard to react to on the fly, because I hadn't heard this particular formulation about preferences and so forth as a way of thinking through the problem. So I will respond to some of the points, but I don't have an on-the-fly interrogation of the inner workings of your alternative. Unless I missed it, I don't think the word power appeared even once in your presentation. And in fact, the foundation of my definition of capitalism is around power. That is, I didn't present this in my discussion here, but in Envisioning Real Utopias, I distinguished 3 ways of organizing power over economic activities. And I refer to them as capitalism, statism, and socialism, socialism. And they differ in the kind of power that they deploy. And that's the most foundational aspect of what renders capitalism capitalist. Capitalism is grounded in power based on the control and ownership of economic resources that you can deploy. Statism is based on power rooted in the control over state resources. That is, it's based on state power. And socialism is based on power that comes from collective action, the ability to persuade. So if you want a slogan, you can get people to do things by bribing them, by forcing them, or by persuading them. Democracy at its core means power is exercised through your ability to persuade people. That's what democracy is. It's essentially a way of subordinating state power to the collective will of the people. But what does that mean? It means your ability through various organizations and processes and institutions which make this possible to persuade people to collaborate with you in the exercise of policy or whatever it is. So the core of capitalism is private ownership, in my view. It's not that that is a redundant statement on voluntary contract. Contracts are a way of ensuring private ownership as opposed to voluntary contracts being the guts of the matter. It's private ownership. And by virtue of having private ownership, you have private power with respect to the lives of other people. And that's what a capitalist system is. You're allocating investments and resources on the basis of your private maximizing behavior because you have the power to do so. You own the stuff. So I centered around power, and that's why, for example, markets, I'm comfortable with a market form of socialism. I don't see a problem. Market socialism does put severe constraints on certain kinds of contracts, to be sure. That is, contracts that enable private accumulation of wealth, but that's a separate issue. Any market economy rules out certain kinds of contracts, and in my ideal of socialism, you can't have a contract in which you agree to work for a dictator. You know, you can't sell yourself into daily slavery, not just lifelong slavery. It's sort of Robert Dahl's view about. That's what democratizing the corporation is about. It's about prohibiting contracts. Within a capitalist firm, you still have private ownership of the means of production, but that doesn't give you the right to dictate to other people. They have to be collaborators in the governance of the firm. Well, there's a lot to say about that, but to me, power is at the center, and that's why economic democracy, as the kind of slogan, quip phrase, is the alternative. It's democratizing the control over the allocation of resources, the setting of priorities, and so on. Now, I'm sure that can be represented as changes in the choice set, but it's really, because I think everything can be, but to me that doesn't capture the notion of domination and control and power that is at the heart of my understanding. Now, as for the very last point around erosion, and why won't capitalism just reassert? Of course it will. I mean, the analogy with feudalism within capitalism is a very imperfect one because it wasn't a strategy. But it wasn't a linear process by which proto-capitalism grew into capitalism. It was constantly thwarted by feudal power relations, which periodically liquidated banks and appropriated the resources and refeudalized things. And it was a very uneven process over a very long period of time. A democratic, egalitarian alternative to capitalism can be built inside of capitalism, and it will be absorbed and deflected, and it therefore requires a continued process of struggle for the expansion. The possibility of that occurring, I think, depends upon contingent features of the years ahead. So here's one scenario. Because of automation and the fourth industrial revolution, unconditional basic income becomes broadly accepted as a necessary mechanism to establish basic social order and social peace in capitalist economies, so that a significant part of resources come to people independently of their participation in markets. That opens up a space then for people to engage in other forms of economic and productive activity. That's number one. Number two, global warming means that a massively interventionist state is now needed for huge climate change public goods provisions. This is apart from decarbonization. This is just the seawalls around Manhattan problem. The market isn't going to produce the seawalls. It's going to require a level of state intervention of the sort that occurred in World War II. That then opens up the possibilities of a repoliticization of economic life, because the state is going to have to be massively taxing in order to allocate resources for these public goods, and the social justice issues around the state's role again comes into play. So that's a context in which things are more up for grabs. The idea then is that capitalism would continue to exist, but it will become in an ever more restricted sphere of economic life rather than the dominant sphere. It loses its dominance because of the expansion of the public goods activities of the state and the expansion of unconditional basic good, which frees people from the obligation to function to participate in the capitalist part of the economy. Well, maybe that's fantasy, but it does allow for capitalism to continue, for the capitalist sector to remain perfectly profitable. It's just that it's a smaller sector of the economy. It's no longer the dominant sector. And ultimately, capitalism between consenting adults behind closed doors is probably okay, as long as I don't have to look at it.
Thank you. Do you want to react?
I give one reaction,
okay,
which opens up to a question, because it's, which is meant as a question in the sense I don't know the answer to it. So my thought to focus on choices, freedom of exchange rather than on ownership, I think follows from from two ideas. One is that freedom of exchange implies ownership of private property. What you're doing in exchange is you're exchanging rights of some form, and those rights so the ownership idea is already implied. But then the second idea is, I completely agree with you that the heart of this is power. But the power doesn't come from, or disagree with me on this, power doesn't come from the ownership. It comes from what you can do with the ownership. It comes from the choices that you can have and how you can use that capital, the wages you can force on people, the use of market power, the use and so on. It's those.
Well, but the fact that the power to allocate your capital is vested in you as a private person, based on what you think is good for you. That's what private ownership is. You decide.
So okay, so then maybe this is semantic.
That's the privateness in the private ownership, right? Is that you get to decide and you don't have to ask anybody else's permission.
Okay, that's what I saw as the decision making.
But it's over the resource. So I would distinguish between the voluntary action of people seeking work and the voluntary action of deploying capital. I just think there's not a complete symmetry between those two, even though they both can be subsumed under the notion of voluntary contract. But they're very different because one is you're allocating your life and the other is you're allocating your stuff. And those are just different human actions, and they have different implications for how a system works.
Right. Okay, yeah. So to bring it to the question, then if you have this distinction then between the choice set and then what choices people actually take, and as you said, socialism, the heart of it is the persuasion, right?
Well, but it's still the heart of socialism is democratic mechanisms. It's not that it's not anarchistic in the sense that everything is just, or libertarian, that you just need the individual voluntary agreement of everybody for some. You have some collective process by which you persuade people as to what to do with these resources. So they're collectively allocated. They can be allocated to a huge range of alternatives, but you collectively allocate them. It's democratic. You get a democratic decision through persuasion rather than through a gun at people's head or the risk of starvation. But it still becomes authoritative once the decision is made. So
okay.
See, this is not individual voluntary contract is all. It's
okay. So the question I wanted to ask is more broadly the sorts of persuasion that one might want to see in order to have people exercising choices, including owners of capital exercising choices that are resulting in fewer negative externalities or less exploitation or these kinds of things. If strategy is one of, if persuasion is one of the strategies in our toolbox, do we have evidence that it's an effective strategy? I'm not talking about persuasion in within the set of people working together in the firm, but persuasion as a broader strategy, organizing the choices that people make, conditional upon the choice sets that's been structured by the taming capitalism.
Well, so by persuasion, I mean the persuasion that goes inside of a union when they decide, should we go on strike? They're not then persuading the employer. They're going on strike and imposing costs on it. They're punishing the employer. They're engaged in struggle. So the persuasion goes on in the decision about how we are going to engage in a collective action. But the consequences of that persuasion isn't, it is persuading the capitalist to change his mind, but by imposing costs. Right?
Yeah. Right.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe there's more opinions on the effectiveness on persuasion and what persuasion can actually mean, and also many other aspects of what we've heard thus far. So I'd like to open the floor for questions now. Please, as we are a big audience, maybe say your name and say where you come from.